do you have a moment just to kind of explain what mindfulness is in y'all's work group's opinion?
Yeah. Well, so first, thanks a lot for inviting me to talk with you, especially now that I just heard about how big your VA catchment area is. So your time is precious. Um, so when I think of mindfulness, I think of it in terms of discrete cognitive skills. And this is really different than envisioning mindfulness as a relaxation technique or simply a way of being thoughtful. Those three skills are not just made up by me, they really are pulled from scientific literature studying the effects of mindfulness, both, excuse me, subjectively. So, what people describe they experience when they're in a meditative state, but then also what we learn from neuroscience studies. And grouping those things all together, our current understanding is that there's three main skills that are taught. And the first one is attention, which can also be described as interoception. And that's the moment to moment awareness of thoughts, uh, feelings like emotions, and sensations as they're ongoing in your own body. The second thing is emotional regulation, and that name is pretty self explanatory. So it's not only being able to recognize that you have emotions when you have them, but then also being able to create a pause between experiencing emotions and reacting to them. So that might seem somewhat easy when we're talking about the emotion of, I don't know, being bored. I guess is that I don't even know if that's an emotion. You don't necessarily just walk out the room or end a conversation. But when we're angry or afraid, things that are really visceral, often the idea of regulating our response seems almost impossible. And in fact, that's not true. That can be trained and strengthened. And then the third thing is metacognition. Some people refer to this as perspective taking or frame shifting. They're all really describing the same thing, which is being able to see more than just one's own personal perspective when it comes to an event or a conversation or a situation. And that 10,000 foot view, if you will, we know opens up possibilities for thinking through how to solve problems, how to interact with others, how to come up with new solutions to old issues. So I think of those three skills as comprising mindfulness.
Why that makes it so much easier for us to really focus on the future if we're practicing these techniques?
Yeah, so I love this question because it's hard to imagine how the two things could be connected, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're so focused on this moment, how can you possibly be thinking about or planning for a future? What's interesting about this is that when we look at those parts of the brain that are consistently activated, in particular strengthened by practicing meditation, there's a few distinct parts that tend to light up and grow stronger under functional neuroimaging studies. And there are relationships, like functional connections between certain parts of the brain, that also become stronger. And so what's kind of fascinating is that one of the parts of the brain that's commonly engaged in the development of mindfulness skills is part of your executive control network in the front and lateral part of your brain. And this part of the brain we know is strengthened and in turn does strengthen our ability to focus and have attention to the moment. In doing that, we're actually noticing more of what's here. And that might not seem important, but for instance, there was a study that was recently published by some neurosurgeons in the UK who taught a modified mindfulness-based curriculum to neurosurgeons and other trainees, and then did a study looking to see if when they watched a video of a common surgical technique that they all were familiar with and were asked to count how many times the scissors were used, that ability to count correctly wasn't any different between those who got mindfulness and those who didn't. But those who got mindfulness training were better able to notice when something that didn't belong in the surgical field was present. So these are like peripheral distractors, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they more
The
accurately
gorilla.
and, yeah, statistically significantly more frequently saw those, noted them, and counted them. So think about like leaving a sponge in your
Mm-hmm.
operative field. Think about like noticing that something's inadvertently bleeding before you leave that area of the abdomen or wherever you're working. So this ability to notice not just what you're anchored on, not just what you think is important or you want to focus on, but more of everything provides us with information we sometimes don't even know how useful it will be. The way that extrapolates to the future is that there's a second part of the brain that gets engaged with mindfulness training, and this is the default mode network. And in fact, we believe that the default mode network is probably the central pillar in neural networks that allow us to plan future actions. And so while Dr. Shoemaker may have been saying this in more of a metaphorical sense, we learn to live in the moment so that we have a broader skill set. We're more aware of what's really going on. We have better self-awareness, and it helps us perhaps perform better in a future that's unknown. In a literal sense, that's also true. In a neurocognitive sense, that's quite true. This default mode network is where we generate possibilities of what we'll do next. It's where we create mental models and run through what those might look like. It's where we think about all of the steps involved in a future activity and evaluate if those are the right steps to get us where we want to go. And when I hear that description, it makes me think of preparing for a big case, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even very specifically as surgeons, these skills are beneficial to us.
So, what do you think your program distinguishes it from other programs and other types of training, and how you were able to get it to other places and integrate externally?
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good question. Well, I think there's a few things about the program itself that make it flexible and accessible and applicable to people. And that's that it's very simple.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there are marvelous mindfulness trainings out there, and they're very focused on exploration and inquiry and processes that sort of unfold in their own time. And that's a wonderful journey to go on if you have that time and that kind of commitment. I found as a surgeon and for surgeons that this was nearly impossible. Um, I'm sure there's always a way to make things work, but truthfully, the constraints of what we need to accomplish in training and then just in our day-to-day lives in practice
Mm-hmm.
really makes something that requires 90 minutes or even 2.5 hours once a week, a daily practice of a half an hour or more, really can be prohibitive. So over the years prior to developing ESRT, I took several of the really evidence-based and well-studied mindfulness courses myself, and I took the two that are the most kind of well-known, MBSR and MBCT, and I took them from several different people, and I looked to see what's different each time and what's the same. And then working with other mindfulness experts and mindfulness teachers, even some like monks in different parts of the world, I started to suss out what's the real essence of each of the lessons that these modules of mindfulness training are trying to teach. So those have been brought down to their bare bones. And we don't leave a lot of room for meandering discovery or the evolution of inquiry, which isn't to say those things are bad, but we bring you right to the punchline and explain very clearly, here's why the thing works, here's why it's worthwhile for you, and here's how to do it. And I think just that practicalness and that kind of streamlined focus makes people who feel time compressed, they feel more relaxed that the way they're spending their time has value. For people who get their appetite whetted and decide to go down the road of a deeper exploration, that's great. More power to them. But for a lot of us, it's not possible. So that focused succinctness of the program, I think, makes it appealing to people. I think I was surprised to find that even though the language and the examples that we give, the ways in which we talk about applying these skills on a day-to-day basis, we make it very practical and pragmatic. It's not lofty or spiritual or metaphysical in any way.
Mm-hmm.
Those straightforward things seem to apply to all kinds of people. We've seen this adopted and work well for ICU nurses, medical students, residents and surgeons in other countries, residents and surgeons in other cultures, so like the Middle East, as well as people who work in other various walks of healthcare. So I guess that means most of us are pretty straightforward, deal with a lot of the same issues, and are just thankful for an expanded tool set. The last thing I think makes dissemination of this possible is that we really studied throughout the early years of introducing ESRT what sort of things need to be in place to make it feasible and well received. And so when a program considers something like this, whether it's ESRT or something else, it's really important that people who are in a leadership position, whether that's literally like the chief or the chair, and also people who are in leadership positions in terms of your colleagues' opinion of things, their sense of trust in new things, that they try the course and see if it actually does what they think it's going to do, if it's actually what they want it to be. That way they can go back to the rest of the folks and say, listen, I was a skeptic too, and I found it beneficial. Or I had this doubt, but here's how it was addressed. I also think it's important to disseminate the evidence. We're all scientists at heart, and I think when we're shown the truth of something in hard science, it allows us to be open-minded. And it's important that we're skeptic when the hard science isn't there. We're skeptical when the hard science isn't there. We also know that it's important that if a program really wants to make this durable, that folks are given some kind of protected time or incentive to do it. Otherwise, you're just adding yet another responsibility on top of the huge pile that everyone already has. And then I'd say the last thing is, and this is something that's sort of the leading edge of this work right now, is figuring out how do we make this augmentation of individual skills relevant to the systems level problems that we know are out there. And, you know, I'll save that answer for a different question.
But can you go a little bit more into about how this training can allow me to really deal with the person in front of me who I clearly have a disagreement with, or the negative situation, a bad outcome in the operating room, or a huge conflict in a critical situation? How does this process help me change the way I see things and respond to this type of conflict, confrontation, or failures?
Yeah, well, that's a really important point. I think it comes back to those three skills I talked about at the beginning. So self-awareness, interoception, emotional regulation, and then perspective taking. And I think, you know, you can take the example of something bad happening in the OR, or as you said, like a conflict with a person who's right in front of you. And there's a few things that happen in both those scenarios for really, really all of us. The first thing is we start to worry, right? So, oh my God, this complication just happened. I don't know what that tube is that I just cut through. Oh my God, what is everyone in the room thinking? Did I just harm this patient? How am I going to get out of this? And then all of the emotions that come with that. you get angry. Well, who cares what everyone else thinks? They aren't in this heart operation. Or you get fearful, like, oh my God, they're going to try to take away my credentialing. Or you get defensive, or your self-imposter syndrome blossoms. I shouldn't be here anyway. What was I ever thinking about becoming a surgeon? So many of us go through these things. Oh, this patient's going to sue me. Will anyone in this room support that it's not my fault? So on and so on. Your body responds to that activation. And so suddenly, not only do you have this like cacophony of thoughts, only some of which are actually related to what's going on, most of which are drawn from our past, our issues we have dealing with ourselves or with other people, maybe old experiences that still haunt us. And then we have all of these physical feelings that come with that. So I talk about this a lot when I discuss this topic in groups, that whether stress is good or bad, whether it's a manageable amount or an overwhelming amount, it feels the same. Literally, in our bodies, it feels the same. So your heart races, your saliva dries up, your breathing gets more rapid, your vision becomes more acute, your hands maybe start to shake from the adrenaline. And when our bodies feel like that, it's a evolutionarily selected trait for us to fight or run. And it takes practice. It takes effort not to do either of those things. So we know that the best response you can have when you have a complication in the OR is to call in someone who's not part of the complication and just get their take on things. Mm-hmm. As often as not, it's frequently like, oh, no, look, it's not as bad as you think. Or, hey, let me help you. We can fix this. Or, I understand I've had a mistake like this before. Let's just work together and set it straight. When it's a conflict with another person, if we can calm ourselves down and not think about like, why are they in my face? Or I always hated this person. Or God, this person always has a bad attitude. We can calm ourselves down. And instead of engaging in this more, think to ourselves, wow, I wonder if they just had a complication in the OR. I wonder if they just had a fight with their spouse. Or maybe this person is a drag, and that's okay. This interaction is going to be over in a few seconds anyways, and I don't need to get caught up in it. So there's so many ways we can use those skills to notice what's going on inside our own minds, calm this reaction in our bodies that's emotional and visceral, and then take a little bit of perspective to realize it's a choice whether or not we want to engage in a conflict.
With surgeons retiring at an alarming rate, and we really would like to keep new surgeons on board for longer periods of time so we can hopefully gain some ground. This is the time we'll really have to look at, what can we do to release and remove some of these chronic stressors that surgeons have. And we talked before that your studies have shown that potentially it really could reduce these stress-induced chronic diseases. And you also said last time that you were able to locate some gene regulation in the stress response and reduction of pro-inflammatory RNA expressions. Where has that gone since you and I talked 3 years ago? Do we have more evidence to support that this actually can, make me not be a brittle older man with chronic neck pain, back pain, and, diabetes and all these other things had I had been using this all my life? And are we able to at least affect these younger surgeons so that they won't have to suffer through this?
Yeah, well, that's funny. That's sort of a added incentive to doing this. We can talk about just feeling more peaceful or at ease. We can talk about benefits to how we interact with others, how we manage big events like complications. And those are sort of subjective or interactive benefits. But then we really have gathered additional data, and this has been done by other groups in other fields for quite some time now, showing that there are true objective benefits. So things that even if you wanted to pretend you were improving in these ways, you couldn't affect this based on just your preferences. You couldn't affect this based on just whether you like or dislike mindfulness. So what I'm talking about specifically are these changes in the neural substrates of the brain that are persistent. So they last, they're not just momentary when you come down off your yoga mat. And that those have directional correlation to gene expression. We've also just shown that the magnitude and direction of that gene expression has a direct correlation to people's self-reported stress. So to break it down a little bit more, we're writing up this work right now, but the most recent randomized controlled trial data that we have, which got kind of delayed being submitted because of COVID, this trial ended just as COVID was hitting us. What we found was that these two parts of the brain I mentioned before, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the default mode network pillar, the precuneus, those two things have a much stronger connection. It's functional, it's persistent, it exists 6 months out from taking the training, than controls. And and that's a group by group comparison. So it's a statistically significant group to group comparison. But then when we take the individuals from the mindfulness exposed group and we look on an individual basis, we see that in individuals, when their functional connectivity is increased, it directly correlates with their stress-related gene expression going down. And that downward trend of stress-related gene expression, so pro-inflammatory genes, is directly related to how much self-reported stress they have. So we're seeing now that there's changes in neural substrates, there's a quantitative, objective, physiologic correlate, which is gene expression, and then there's a behavioral change, which is the lived experience of stress. So you make a really good point. I focused on those data simply to say, this is not an opinion. This is not a preference. This is an objective, quantitative influence that either you have to appreciate or you have to stop saying you believe in science. But there's the benefit that it actually can make us healthier over time. And I often forget to focus on that, but you're absolutely right. This is a hard job. A lot of us, you hit 5 years and then 10 years, and then beyond that, you start to feel the physical accumulation of this work. And yeah, I don't think anyone's ever studied that, but it certainly makes sense to me that we could spare ourselves literally some aches and pains.
Yeah, one of the things that Susan McKinnon and I had talked about, she had done the Olga Jonason lecture at the Congress, and I actually got her to get on a Zoom call with me. And she goes through the little 6 pathways that sort of lead you to a pathway of resiliency. And as I look at each one, this training that you described really goes into effects and allows you to do those other things. I mean, if you don't have the capabilities of doing what you've described, you don't get the sleep. It makes you hard to form connections. It makes you hard to engage in self-compassion, and all the other pathways that are geared towards making your life much more resilient. Without this training, without building that resiliency in of itself, I'm seeing how the other one really would be nearly impossible unless you cement this as the cornerstone for this whole process. So I thank you so much. I'm just so excited about this. And I really appreciate you, speaking to me 3 years ago and again today. You have anything else you want to pass on to everyone?
I think it's really important to make the point, especially in the climate you just described, where So many physicians are retiring early, leaving the field when they've barely just begun, choosing a different path altogether, or young people not choosing medicine in the first place. This kind of training does not fix or obviate the huge systemic issues that are out there. That's not the point. It's not meant to distract us from those things, and it's not meant to replace addressing those things. I think of it like when you have a septic patient who shows up in your emergency room. I'm a acute care surgeon. I do emergency general surgery. When a septic patient shows up, we all know that the way to fix their sepsis is to find the source and control it, right? But we don't just stand there doing nothing else while we wait to find the source and control it. We give broad spectrum antibiotics. And we do that because that increases that patient's chance of surviving until we figure out the source and fix it. So I think of it that way. These are skills to help us survive while we and until we fix those system level problems. My hope is that more of us who learn some skills to bring down some of our disillusion and demoralization and anger, which I think all of us feel if we're awake, when we can dial that down enough to tap back into that creativity and that sense of possibility, we can start to think about what the solutions to these issues should be. And those solutions should come from us, not from whomever business person is running our healthcare institution. So I would just say, giving ourselves skills like this is not putting the onus of the problem on us. It's helping us survive enough till we can see the solution.
Well, I value your time. I'm sure you have, it's still 3:30 there, so I'm sure you still have a lot of work to do. So I appreciate everything. And hopefully we can get together again sooner than 3 years and kind of go through what y'all are doing and how you've been able to utilize this in other areas in systemic reform within your own institution. And I will be passing this on to my staff and trying to encourage them in utilizing the resources that we have. So this is exciting. Thank you. You've made my day. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you too. Yeah, it's always a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
All righty. Well, you take care. All righty. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.